So our question is, should men and women's sports have equal coverage on major media networks? Kira has the yes and Zach has the no.
When it comes to sports, men and women shouldn't have equal coverage due to the revenue difference in the amount of views and the amount of regular season games.
Men and women should have equal coverage on major media networks.
Women's sports don't collect enough revenue from the viewers to get that much coverage. We can see that in the NBA. Over the average season, they collect $7.4 billion compared to the WNBA, who only has $60 million in revenue each year. So we see that from the viewers don't contribute enough to the sport for them to get that much coverage. They don't collect enough money for them to be able to give out.
While women's stories are rarely headlined compared to men's stories. While looking at an article, should female athletes sue the networks for equal coverage, they stated they scrolled through almost the entire ESPN page to only find 3 headlines about women's stories. For example, in quotes, "This is ridiculous. They've got a headline story about the NFL draft, which isn't even happening for months, and nothing about women's sports."
Women's sports don't generate enough views to have equal coverage. We can see this through the World Cup. The Men's World Cup had 3.2 billion views compared to the Women's World Cup, who only had 760 million views. And we can also see it through, again, the NBA and the WNBA. NBA games average only 413,000 viewers compared to the NBA, who has 1.46 million viewers.
Their coverage time was shockingly low, though. In an article called Gender in Televised Sports, state the shocking percentage in how much women's sports were televised. The coverage of women's sports is lower than ever. ESPN's nationally televised program, SportsCenter, devoted only 1.4% of its airtime to coverage of women's sports, and a decline in their coverage of women's sports compared with 1999, 2.2%, and 2004, 2.1%. They're rarely showing women's sports.
Also, there aren't enough regular season games for women's sports to have equal coverage. We can see that again through the NBA and the WNBA. The NBA has 82 regular season games compared to the WNBA only having 34. So there is a wider range of opportunity for the men's sports to have the greater amount of coverage of the games.
It is understandable that women's sports are less popular than men's sports, which leads bigger companies to broadcast more of men's sports. However, that gives no reason as to why there can't be equal coverage. Maybe if sports gave equal coverage, it would draw more attention to women's sports. So my last point is that even when women's sports started gaining more attention over the years, they were still thrown to the side. For example, the WNBA finals were thrown onto ESPN2, greatly restricting public access.
Some may argue that women don't have the same amount of revenue, views, and lack of regular season games because of the fact that they don't have enough coverage. However, we can see why women's sports shouldn't have the same amount of coverage just in the viewership of the World Cups. All 52 matches aired live for the women's sports, including 22 on broadcast television, and more than any FIFA Women's Cup or World Cup ever. And 27 of them were on Fox Sports 1. And the men's World Cup still got 2.4 billion more views. So soccer is the most watched sport throughout the whole world, and women in the Women's Cup had the most coverage it's ever had, and it still had 2.4 billion less views, and only 3 games weren't broadcasted live either on a normal television network or on Fox Sports 1.
Okay, that concludes the first presentation.